Okay, guys, so today we're going to be looking at the British control in India, and we're going to be looking at how um, the British get, as I say, get increased control within India after the 1750s. And then we're going to be looking ahead at sort of what is the impact of this in the 19th century and onwards, obviously, ultimately leading up to Mahatma Gandhi. So let's turn our attention first to how do the British get control over India or increased control over India in the 18th century, right? So one of the things that happens, and I think we know this from earlier, right, is that the British have been in India for 100 years, over 100 years, by the mid 1700s, right? Whether that's when we discuss um, British trade there in the 1600s, the tea trade, they have sort of different parts of India starting in the 1600s, right? However, we know ultimately in the end that the British wound up controlling much of India, or if not all of India, really, by the late 19th century. So how do we get there? The first major event that we really need to talk about is in the 1700s, right? In the early 1700s, the British East India Company, this sort of famous company that winds up trading with so much of India and the tea trade in the 1700s, really gets more control within India at this point. And they set up their sort of global capital at the city of Calcutta, which I'll point out on a map in a few moments. But the British East India Company winds up dominating the area. And how do they do that? The British are pretty smart when it comes to manipulating people. And what they do is they control the India through negotiating with local princes. So rather than spending more money trying to in flood a whole bunch of British people into India, and then you have to pay for them to be there, and you have to pay for their housing and all this stuff. What the British do is they wind up supporting princes and local leaders through bribes and gifts, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's a way for them to be more targeted at who they approach, and it's a lot cheaper to do that. However, in the mid 1700s, there's a global war that happens between the British and the French, and their different parties. In America, we call this war the French and Indian War. In a global context, in an AP world context, in a world history context, we talk about this in terms of the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. When that war happens, this global war, and ultimately the British win, which we know, France winds up having to give up a lot of its territories. And one place in particular is India, Canada, and others, but India is important for our story. When the British receive India, this gives the British East India Company more control throughout throughout the subcontinent, and it secures the fact that the British East India Company will be the major and dominant trading faction within India for the next, well, century and a half. The major battle that's important there is the Battle of Plassey. It's after the Battle of Plassey that the British East India Company winds up controlling this territory and gives the British so much more, British East India Company so much more dominance in the region. This also gives um, this also gives the British more control, and they establish what are called the Governor General. And the first real Governor General that is important to our story is Robert Clive, and you'll look at a document by him in a little bit. But Robert Clive and the Governor Generals are the governors that are established by the British government in India. So it's an interesting relationship where you have this private company that is then the major dominant figure through the British government with the support of the Governor General. So it's a really interesting relationship. But again, we'll look at a document by him in a little bit. But the relationship between the people of India and the British government becomes interesting. The British government winds up trying to convert people from Buddhism or Islam into Christianity. And they also, along with that, start to try and prohibit local traditions. So sati, which is sometimes called widow burning or widow sacrifice, where when a widow is when a husband dies, his widow would throw herself on the funeral pyre to be with her husband in death. And the British see this as barbaric, so they wind up trying to prohibit it. In fact, that gets a lot of backlash. But we'll talk about British relationships in just a moment. Another thing they do is they try and bring back the caste system and really hone in on it, right? The caste system talks about the relationship of people through different ranks of society. And the British want to heighten that. British want to talk about how great they are to the people of India, but also British at the top, everybody else below them. So they really want to focus on the caste system. The major event that turns the tide for the British really comes in the 1857, so exactly 100 years after the Battle of Plassey. The Sepoy Rebellion becomes a huge moment of Indian nationalism. Now let's just talk about what was happening, right? And this, well, I should say this is just sort of an overview slide. Looking at this, right? I want to just point out a couple of things here, and maybe this slide's a little bit better. So we have the Bengal region, which will become important, and Calcutta is over here, right? So where the British East India Company has its headquarters. By 1857, this is what the map is going to look like in India. The British are going to control all of these red regions, while the yellow regions are going to be controlled by the local princes. But the British are going to be using their influence with money and power to control those regions through support. So it's going to be, although the British control directly, let's say, the red areas, the yellow areas are going to be loosely, or if not totally, under British control through bribery and support. So let's talk about the Sepoy Rebellion and sort of what leads to it, and then what are the effects of it. So what leads to it? The British within India have, again, as I said, don't use British people. Instead, what they use are locals, because it is so expensive to try and move that many British people there. The British work more through local governments and local people rather than sending people there. Although they do send people there, and I'm not going to say that they don't. So the British develop a really strong group of fighters called the Sepoys. The Sepoys are British-trained Indian troops, but they are led by British officers. And there's about, as I say here, 300,000 Sepoys to about 50,000 British soldiers. So just to point that out, right, that's a 1 to 6 rate, or I should say 6 to 1 ratio. A lot more Indian soldiers than there are British soldiers. Now, the British East India Company is not obviously being very accepting to the people of India. So they're, again, trying to force Christianity, prohibiting local activities, sati and others, forcing the caste system, who's at the bottom, who's at the top. So the people of India are really, really upset with how the British are controlling the area. Then the British East India Company puts in some really heinous rules. One of the ones that becomes really a big sticking point the year before the Sepoy Mutiny begins is called the Doctrine of Lapse. Now, this law is a law that winds up, obviously, as I say, being really challenging to the people of India, because it says that if a piece of property, and particularly a prince's piece of property, goes uninherited, meaning if a prince or a person dies without an heir, that would return to the next person above in the class. And the British would always basically have it be them. So this is a way that the British are basically stealing territory from the people of India. Also, if a sepoy or if another Indian person committed any crime against a British soldier or British officer, they were severely punished, most of the time by execution. So the people of India are really disgruntled and quite frankly very, very upset with how the British are treating them. And this is not obviously helping the British win any favors. Finally, what happens next is sort of the big straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were. In 1856-7, the British government sends in a whole bunch of new guns. And when the guns arrive, they have new types of cartridges. And the people of India, the Bengal, excuse me. So where are we talking again? Just to point this out, right? We're talking about the Bengal region. So the Bengal region is a very interesting region. Today it's portions of Bangladesh in 2020, but in this time period, it's part of this larger India. And the people here are a mix of Hindu and a mix of Muslim people, right? So you have two different religions living in the region. So the British send in these new guns, and people start to think that they're greased with animal fat to help lubricate the barrel of the rifle. However, the rumor that breaks out is that they are lubricated with a mix of cow and pig fat. When this rumor breaks out, this alienates all of the sepoys, right? Because half are Muslim, or a portion are Muslim, a portion are Hindu. And because of that, Hindus can't touch cow products, Muslims can't touch pig products. This alienates all of the groups, and this rumor is used by agitators who don't like British rule to try and overthrow the British control. As a result, because Britain cannot let India go, the British crush this rebellion with extreme efficiency, send in steamships, send in a whole bunch of different military expeditions, and crush this extremely violently. And as a result of that, Britain gets tremendous control over India. And this is the point where we stop talking about sort of a business control, the British East India control of India, and now we move to the British Raj, the British control over India. Queen Victoria, who is the Queen of Britain at this time, calls herself the Empress of India, although that comes a little bit later. She still calls herself, she does ultimately call herself the Empress of India. So you have a huge takeover of the British using these opportunities to do that. I should also point out here that this is the British government uses, because of bad treatment by the British East India Company, the British government uses that opportunity to get more control in India. And they wind up saying that it's because of the Indian control, because of the British East India's lack of judgment that this happens. I want to just put this slide up, and we'll talk about something, and I'll bring this up in a little bit, right? The British are pretty bad to the Indians, and I'm not going to say that they're good, totally good. But what I do want to point out is that the British do some good. So what they do is they help industrialize India. They crisscross India with railroads, and I point out this picture here, so that the British can get their, I mean, it's totally for the British benefit, but you know, in order to get tea from different portions of the areas, cotton from different parts of India, it's important to have railroad systems. So the British develop railroads to do so. The other big benefit that the British do, and I'm going to pull this back up just to show an image here of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi, Nehru, and others become educated in the West, right? And your book calls them the Western educated elites. Indian populations, the people of India who can afford it, send their sons, mostly sons, to Britain to receive education, right? They go to Oxford or Cambridge. The purpose of this is that they have better connections and they have better education in Britain, or at least education that can help them get promoted within the ranks of the British society. So wealthier families will send their sons to Oxford or Cambridge, get educated, and then come home back to India to work within the government or work wherever. And Gandhi and Nehru and others are going to become part of this British education.